So last week's Torah portion was Vayishlach. Why last week? We missed last week. That is to say, and he sent, which is the first word of this portion. And this portion has the most verses. So I thought the best summary would be to read it all. It must have plenty to say. I'm just kidding. All right, to give a quick recap of the last week's portion, 7 days ago, seeing we didn't gather, it began with Jacob fleeing to Padan Aram after his mother's request for him to do so, to the threat of Jacob's murder from his brother Esau. And it ends with his departure from Padan Aram, to which he fled. So he goes there, he comes back. What happened on that journey? He had a dream that rocked his world, in which he saw the heavens and earth connected via a ladder in a place he called Bethel. Some more important notes from this first stop would be that it is here in this dream that the Lord appears to him, gives him a blessing, the promise of his forefathers, a land and numerous seed. It is also here that Jacob makes a covenant with God and vows to the Lord that if the Lord would but give him food to eat and raiment to wear, and that he could return to this land in peace, that he would be his God, and he would return a tenth of everything that God gave him. Continuing east, Jacob comes to a well, meets the woman he wants to marry, works for his hand, gets deceived by Laban, the trickster, his father-in-law, ends up with 2 wives because of it, works 7 more years, works for flocks after that, more trickery, more children, more wives, more trickery, eventually gets fed up, and by the commandment of the Lord, he returns home. He leaves without Laban knowing. Laban chases him down. Eventually that gets worked out, and Jacob continues on his way home in peace. Or so you might think. Here it is worth noting that Jacob was told by his mother when he was going away that she would sin for him when Esau wasn't angry anymore. This was the reason why he fled. Now it has been a long, long time since he's been gone, like 21, 22-ish years. And his mom has not yet sent for him. Maybe Esau's cooled down in that time. It's been a long time since he's been around. Maybe his mother just forgot to send for him. But I think all the mothers in here would sharply reject to that statement, and even the Torah wouldn't support it, seeing that Jacob was clearly favored by Rebekah, so much so that she said, "Let me be cursed so that you may be blessed." So it's not unsafe to presume that Esau might still be a bit angry about their last encounter, the blessing heist. And he sent. Thus we begin our portion. And since it is large and I'm not the most studied, I shall make some quick notes of some of the fascinating things that I saw, but not yet figured out the meaning of. And I'll end with something I'll share with you that I got out of it as an encouragement and an exhortation that I hope you find as a blessing. Chapter 32. It begins in verse 3. I call this the consequence, the crisis, and the catalyst. So Jacob sends some messengers to Esau to bring him a kind greeting and requests that he finds grace in his sight. Verses 4 and 5. This should recall the Noah story and the phrase used there, the grace in his sight. Jacob seeking to find life in a situation of destruction and judgment. The response doesn't look good. Esau and 400 men are coming to greet him. This is 82 more men than Abraham used to fight off 5 kings. So we don't think he's throwing him a party here. So Jacob catches on quick. He devises a plan for the worst-case scenario of this attack in verses 7 and 8, where he'll split his camps up so that some of the people can at least escape. Then he pleads with God on the basis of what he knows of God's promise and of God's character, in verse 9 through 12. After that prayer, he creates a present for Esau and sends it ahead of him in order to appease his brother before they meet face to face. However, what happens next is unavoidably important, and it seems to be the center of a large chiasm with the going to Bethel on either side, and it goes in with different events, that I'm certain I have not even begun to grasp the beginning of this linchpin and the turning point of this story. But in Genesis 32, verses 24 through 31, says, "And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto them, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince thou hast power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And asked him and said, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." And he said, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name?" And he blessed him there. Let's know some things. So one, it's a super interesting start to this little thing. It says, "And he was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him." You can't wrestle someone when you're alone. For this reason, many people think that Jacob is actually wrestling with himself and with what God's working on within himself. 2, Jacob refuses to let go without a blessing. My brother pointed this out in a Bereshit study. I think it's a beautiful thought experiment to ask yourself, what if he would have done that the first time? Like, instead of trying to deceive his dad, if he just went and grabbed onto him and said, "I'm not letting you go until you blessed me," what might have happened? Anyways, verse 3. When he asks him his name by the angel, Jacob admits his name and accepts his identity, which I think we can ask, why the heck in the middle of a wrestling match is he asking for his name? Well, this makes sense if you know that he didn't say his name to his father. When he said, "Who are you?" he said, "I'm Esau." But not this time. He rectifies that event. He says, "I'm Jacob," accepting who he is, a supplanter, a heel catcher his whole life, but not anymore. At this point, his identity changes the moment he accepts that that's the way he's been acting. Some fun notes about the forefathers, though. Abraham has an addition to his name. Sarah is the only female amongst our matriarchs that has a name change. Isaac's name was given to him before he was born, but Jacob is the only one who has a complete name change. He was called Jacob, and he's called something completely different. Abraham and Abram, very similar, like a great father and a father of nations. Similar story. But Jacob to Israel is supplanter to like one who wrestles with God or a prince of God. So it's very interesting. But it's also very interesting that though Abraham and Jacob both received the same blessing of no longer shall your name be fill in the blank of the old name, but now given him a new name. Israel, Jacob's new name, is still referred to as Jacob throughout the text, when Abraham is not. He's only referred to as Abraham after that event. I think that's very interesting. Don't know what it means, but I hope you'll enjoy. Chapter 33. You have the reckoning and the reconciling. Let's not forget, Esau's still on his way. Jacob spies Esau from afar off and enacts his plan. The presents are sent, and the multiple camps maneuver is set up so that they can escape in verse 1 and 2. The final act of humility is made as he bows 7 times as he approaches his brother. The 2 brothers meet together and are reunited with a kiss from Esau to Jacob's neck. Note that at Jacob's departure, only Esau wept at the loss of his birthright. Now at his return, they cried together. Verse 4. Then there is discussion about this huge present that Jacob sent to Esau, which at first Esau refuses. He says, "I have enough, I don't need any more." But Jacob presses the matter. He says, "Nay, I pray thee," in verse 10 and 11, "if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. Therefore I have seen thy face, as though I have seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt gracious with me, and because I have enough." And he urged him, and he took it. Esau requests Jacob to join him in Seir, but Jacob journeys to Succoth, travels a little further to Shalem, buys a field there from the children of Hamor, and he erects an altar there, calling it El Elohe Israel. It is God, the God of Israel. Chapter 34 is the defilement of Dinah. Here in Shalem, it seems the last thing Jacob has is peace, which by interpretation is what that name means, Shalem, it's peace. And the next chapter confuses the mess about me. And it's not a very PG chapter, but it is scripture nonetheless. So I shall touch on a few things worth noting. Dinah is Leah's daughter, and when she went out to see the daughters of the land, she was stolen away by force by Shechem, who is Hamor's son. Yes, the same Hamor from whom Jacob bought this piece of land. Shechem grows fond of his captives, so Hamor tries to strike a deal with Jacob and his sons, saying, "And make ye marriages with us, and give your daughters unto us, and take our daughters unto you. And ye shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade ye therein, and get you possessions therein." That's verse 9 and 10. And Shechem makes a promise after it. He says, "You can ask of any dowry, I will happily pay it." And seeing that there's more of a hostage situation than a fair trade, the brothers use what advantage they have, that dowry, to conspire. And they demand that the men of the city be circumcised. They agree and return to pitch the idea unto their people. However, in their, Hamor and Shechem's explanation of what will happen, we see their true intent. For they said to their people, shall not their cattle and their substance and every beast of theirs be ours? Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us. It's verse 23 of 34. So 3 days rolls around, and big surprise, they didn't intend peace. When all the men were sore, Simeon and Levi, they came on the city boldly with their swords, and they slew all the men. Verse 25, and they spoiled the city. This displeases Jacob in their actions. And the situation, however, seems at the moment somewhat rectified to the reader, and if not, you're just left hanging. That's the end of that story. It moves on. So let's note some of those things. The relationships of the characters. I think it's important to note that Shechem is a prince of the land, and Israel being a prince with God, that Dinah is then a princess of Israel. So this hostage situation is like a war crime. Scripture says that they ended up having to remove Dinah from Shechem's house where she was like held prisoner, so to speak. I think it's interesting the verbiage that Hamor has in his request to find grace in Jacob's sight, and that the brothers, Dinah's brothers, respond deceitfully, for that would be a reproach to us, they said, to give our daughter to one who is uncircumcised. Like these things kind of echo the stories that just happened before us, how Jacob was asking for grace in his sight from Laban and from Esau, that Laban responds to Jacob in a deceitful way by giving him layup and goes, oh, well, it's not so done in our land to give the younger before the older. Like these things are kind of clicking, some different stories ringing. So like Jacob's probably feeling like this weight of some of his offense coming back on him. But in the end, I think it's very interesting to note that the wicked's plans always come back upon themselves. Though they desired to take all the possessions and all the lives, who really lost their possessions and lives? Wicked weren't prospered in this one. Chapter 35. So we have the gifts and the graves. So God calls Jacob to return to Bethel, where they met with God at the first. Strangely enough, possibly Jacob, but definitely his sons, have idols with him that they must put away before they journey back. So they bury them underneath a tree before their journey to Bethel again. My personal assumption is that these were probably acquired in the spoiling of the land from the previous chapter, but wherever they came from, they had to go. Jacob builds an altar in Bethel and calls it El Bethel. The Lord himself reestablishes the name change and recommits the blessing of the multitude of children and the land. I think it's very interesting that the blessing is flipped in this son at Bethel, and originally he's laying on the land and he's promised land and children. He comes back with his children and he's promised children and a land. A little more chiasm to look out for. Much is also buried in this chapter. First, the idols are buried, and then afterward, Rebekah's nurse, Deborah, who we learn her name at her death, I think is very interesting, is buried. And then Rachel goes into labor and is also buried, for she dies in labor. However, Rachel's death in labor also is the birth of Benoni, who is his father name's Benjamin, and the place where she died was Bethlehem. It seems particularly and prophetically significant to me that someone is born in Bethlehem, named Son of My Sorrows, and the father calls him Son of My Right Hand. Maybe ring some messianic bells for y'all. Chapter 36 is a genealogy of Esau, who is Edom. I have little to say on this large and surprising detailed account of Esau's descendants. However, please feel free to enlighten me with anything that y'all see in that genealogy. But one thing that I wanted to share with y'all, which is the more personal note that's been on my heart, happens in the first part of this Torah portion. And I hope that as a principle that you'll be able to implement in your own life and find to be a blessing. But first, some questions. Why does Jacob send messengers to Esau? Why continue towards Esau in absolute vulnerability after the fear of an unavoidable attack? Why the wrestling? Why urge Esau to take the present after he refused it? And why is the altar built at the end of this counter and not a moment sooner? I believe the meditation for a meaningful solution to the first four questions are evidence that Jacob is truly trying to make something right with his brother. Otherwise, why go through so much turmoil? Wouldn't it have just been simpler to altogether avoid meeting back up with his brother? But no, He sent messengers ahead because he could only travel slowly with the flocks and his children, as he mentions later. He greatly desired to meet his brother without going to his brother's land. He presses forward in the face of fear, for he had faith in the promise of God and a fervent desire to foster a righteous relationship. He wrestled with the wrong he wrought in his past and the right he sought to redeem. And he urged Esau to take the gift so that he could return the blessing that he stole. For it was the blessing of wealth that his father gave him, so it was his wealth that he gave back to Esau. But truly, put forth Jacob everything he had to make right this relationship, at a great risk to repair it. And then he built an altar. But this is the first record of another altar since Bethel. I think it's very interesting, because I believe that this altar is the first time Jacob fulfills his promise. What promise, you might ask? Well, the promise that he would give a tenth to the Lord of all he had. He made that promise. He's returned to the land in peace, and so now he gives a tenth to the Lord of all that he has. I can think of two reasons why it's not built until now. One, Jacob felt that what he had was not his, but a result of a stolen blessing, and thus it was not fit to be given for God. Or maybe he hasn't returned yet in peace, so he waited. But I have another suspicion. Perhaps Jacob also understood the necessity of being right with your brother before you give God a gift. Yeshua said in Matthew 5:23, "Therefore, if you bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar. Go thy way, first be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift." Maybe this was the story that Yeshua had in mind when he said that. Or maybe Yeshua was the Word made flesh, and that this story was always meant to teach just that. A small encouragement: our Lord cares about your relationships with other people, especially your family. Do all you can to make good on those relationships so that your love of God is seen by the evidence of your life, and the love for your brother is not and should not be what inhibits your love for God. As John says, if a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? It's in 1 John 4:20. But rather let that love be the proof of a deep and meaningful, a heavenly love that is effective in your life to the point you risk all to restore a relationship and repair the damage dealt to this world. This is the kind of love and faith that surpasses this world's existence, and is the love that Yeshua first demonstrated to us. Shabbat Shalom. Happy Hanukkah.